My name is Louis Coleman. I am 69 years old, and I am a retired architect. To my only son, Terrell, I am just a simple old man, a burden he has to take care of in my old age. He and his new wealthy in-laws certainly thought so. I know this because I came home a day early from my trip. I found my wife Diane crying all alone in our living room. But from the kitchen I could hear my son laughing. He was laughing loudly with his in-laws as they measured my walls, planning to move me and my wife down into the basement. They thought I was finished. They thought I was powerless. They didn't know that the simple old man they were trying to throw away was secretly a multimillionaire, and they didn't know that I had already set the trap for them. Before I continue this story, tell me in the comments where you are listening from. And please like and subscribe if you believe that respect for our elders is non-negotiable. The flight from Chicago had been smooth. I decided not to call. At 69, you don't get many chances to surprise the woman you've loved for 45 years. I pictured Diane's face, that slow smile that still made my heart ache. I turned my key in the lock. The house was quiet. Too quiet. "Diane," I called out, dropping my carry-on bag in the foyer. "I'm home, baby." The only answer was a muffled sound from the living room. I walked in and my good mood evaporated. Diane was curled up on the sofa, the one we bought together in 1985. Her shoulders were shaking. She was crying a deep, painful kind of sob that tore right through me. "Diane, honey, what is it? What's wrong?" She jumped, startled. Her eyes were red and swollen. "Louis, is you? You're not supposed to be home until tomorrow. I took an earlier flight." "What happened? Did someone hurt you?" She shook her head, trying to wipe the tears from her face. They're here, Louis, in the kitchen." I froze. As she said it, another sound cut through the silence of the house. Laughter. It was coming from my kitchen. It was my son, Terrell. But he wasn't alone. I heard the sharp, aristocratic laugh of his mother-in-law, Barbara Preston. "Who's here?" I asked, though my stomach already knew the answer. "Terrell," Diane whispered, as if she were afraid to say their names, "and Heather and her parents. They just showed up an hour ago. They're measuring. Measuring." The word made no sense. I left Diane on the sofa and walked down the hall. The laughter got louder. They were comfortable. They were happy. While my wife cried 20 feet away. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen. The scene in front of me felt like a betrayal. Terrell, my son, was holding one end of a metal tape measure. His wife Heather was scribbling notes on a pad, and her parents, Richard and Barbara Preston, were standing by my refrigerator sipping what looked like my good whiskey. "I'm telling you, Richard," Barbara said, swirling the glass. "This entire wall has to go. We can knock it out and put a massive Kakata marble island right here." Richard Preston, a man who always looked like he was smelling something bad, nodded. "Good bones, but the whole thing is dated. Look at this cabinetry. Oak. It's pathetic." Heather laughed. "I know, Daddy. It's awful, but once we get the new appliances in, it'll be fabulous. Won't it?" Terrell, my son, my 38-year-old son, just nodded, his eyes shining with a greedy light I had never seen before. "It's going to be amazing, honey. Absolutely amazing." "Terrell." My voice cut through the air like a razor. Terrell dropped the tape measure. It clattered to the tile floor with a loud metallic crash. Dad, he went pale. Dad. What are you doing home? Your flight was tomorrow. I live here. I said, my voice dangerously calm. A better question is, what are you doing and why is your mother crying in the living room? The Prestons turned to look at me. There was no surprise in their eyes. No shame, just annoyance, as if I were a servant who had interrupted dinner. Oh, Louis, you're back, Barbara said, taking a delicate sip of my whiskey. Don't be so dramatic. Diane is just being emotional. We were just planning the remodel. My remodel, I asked. Heather stepped forward. She was a tall, thin woman who always dressed in sharp angles and her personality matched. She put her hand on her hip. Yes, Dad. We're telling you now. Terrell and I are moving in. I looked at Terrell. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the floor like a child who'd been caught. Moving in. Of course, Heather said as if I were slow. Our apartment is lovely, but it's a rental, this house. Well, it's going to be Terrell's anyway. We might as well start making it our own now. It's just practical. I couldn't speak. I looked at the cabinets Henry, my father, had helped me install. I looked at the floor tiles Diane and I had laid ourselves one weekend back in '92. Heather continued oblivious. We'll be taking the master bedroom, of course. It has the en-suite, she gestured vaguely toward the hall. You and Diane can move your things down to the guest room in the basement. It's perfectly comfortable. And honestly, at your age, you don't really need all that space, do you? It'll be much more convenient for everyone. The basement. They were going to move me to my own basement. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had designed this house. I had drawn the blueprints myself. I had hammered nails alongside the construction crew. This wasn't just a house. It was my life's work. And they were talking about it like it was a piece of furniture they could just move. Get out. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Heather actually laughed. Excuse me, what did you say? I said, I repeated louder this time. Get out of my house. Richard Preston, who had been silent, stepped forward. He was a man used to authority, a man who ran a hedge fund and looked down on everyone else. Now see here, Louis, let's not be children. We are family, and we are discussing a practical solution for your situation. My situation, your age, Barbara chimed in, setting her glass down. Your limited income. Terrell has been very open with us about his finances. We know how much he has to help you out every month. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Terrell helped me. I had never taken a dime from my son, not one. We think it's admirable, Barbara continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. But it's a burden, and now that he's married to Heather, we are his family too. We've decided to shoulder that burden. We're going to take over this house. We'll handle the bills. We'll handle the maintenance. And in return, Richard added, you and Diane get a safe place to live downstairs. It's more than fair. I turned to my son. He was still staring at the floor. His silence was his confession. Terrell, he flinched. Look at me. Slowly his eyes met mine. They were filled with shame, guilt, and something ugly. Weakness. Your wife is crying, I said. my voice shaking with a rage so profound it scared me. These people who I have never invited into my home are drinking my liquor and dividing my house like spoils of war. Tell them to get out. Tell them Terrell now. This was it. The moment of truth. The moment my son would stand up and be the man I raised him to be. Terrell looked at me. He looked at Heather. He looked at her wealthy, powerful parents. And then he broke. "Dad, just listen," he pleaded. "Just stop making a scene. You're embarrassing me." Embarrassing him. "They're right, Dad." He said the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "This house is too much for you. We can help. You're not getting any younger. We worry about you and Mom all the time. This is the best way." The best way, I whispered, to kick me out of my own bedroom. "Dad, stop." He finally yelled, his face red. "Just stop it. I am tired of this. I'm tired of worrying about this old house. Tired of worrying about your bills. Tired of pretending we're not all just waiting. This is my house now. Or it will be. Heather and I are making the decisions. Just accept it." And just like that, the rage was gone. It didn't fade. It vanished. It was replaced by a cold, clear silence in my head. The world sharpened. I saw my son not as the boy I had raised, but as a 38-year-old stranger, a parasite who had just confirmed my deepest, darkest fears. I saw his wife, Heather, smiling a smug look of victory on her face. I saw her parents looking at me with the detached pity of zookeepers observing an old lion. The son I knew was gone. "I see," I said. My voice was perfectly even. I nodded slowly. I turned my back on them. I walked out of the kitchen past my son, who looked confused by my lack of shouting. I walked back into the living room. Diane was still on the sofa, looking at me with terrified, hopeful eyes. "Louis, what's happening?" I didn't stop. I walked to the coat closet. I took out her winter coat. I walked back to her and held it open. "Get your coat, Diane." "What?" she sniffled. "Louis, what are you doing?" "We're leaving," I said. My voice was calm. It was the calm of a general who has just seen the entire battlefield and knows exactly where to strike. Terrell and the others had followed me into the living room. "What are you talking about, Dad?" Terrell asked, his voice a mix of confusion and irritation. "Where are you going? You can't just leave." I helped Diane to her feet, guiding her, arms into the sleeves of her coat. She looked at me, her eyes asking 1,000 questions, but she trusted me. She always had. I picked up her small purse from the table. I turned to face my son. I looked at him, at his wife, at her parents. "You said you were taking over," I said. "You said you were making the decisions now." I walked toward the front door. "So take over," I said, pulling the door open. "It's all yours." I guided Diane out onto the porch into the cold night air, and I pulled the door shut behind us. The click of the lock was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of an entire life ending and a new one beginning. I didn't call a taxi. I used the black car service I keep on my phone. A dark, spotless Lincoln Navigator pulled up to the curb in less than 2 minutes. Diane was shivering beside me, whether from the cold night air or from the shock. I couldn't tell. She looked at the expensive car, then at me, her eyes wide with confusion. "Louis, what are we doing? Where are we going?" "We're going somewhere safe, Diane." "Get in." The driver held the door for her. I gave him the address. The Four Seasons downtown. Diane didn't speak a single word during the entire ride. She just stared out the window, her reflection showing the tear tracks glistening on her cheeks. When we pulled up under the bright, elegant portico of the hotel, she tensed. "Louis, we can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. This place must cost $500 a night. We don't have this kind of money." "It's all right, honey," I said, taking her hand. I walked us to the front desk. The night manager looked up, and his professional smile immediately became one of genuine recognition. "Mr. Coleman, it is a pleasure, sir. We weren't expecting you." "It was a last-minute decision, James," I said. "I need the presidential suite immediately." "Of course, sir. Right. This way. We'll have your bags sent up." Diane grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my coat. "Louis, Mr. Coleman, presidential suite." I just squeezed her hand. "Let's get upstairs first, then I promise we will talk." The suite was breathtaking. It was larger than the entire first floor of our house. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the living room, showing the entire city glittering below us like a carpet of diamonds. Diane walked into the center of the room and just stopped. She touched the smooth marble of a side table as if she wasn't sure it was real. "Louis," she said, her voice shaking badly now, "I am scared. What is happening? How do they know you here?" I took off my coat and laid it carefully on a chair. I sat her down on a plush velvet sofa that probably cost more than our old car. "Diane, I need you to just listen for a moment. I have to make a phone call. It is the most important call of our lives." I pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. The anger from the house had burned away all the shaking, leaving only cold, hard steel. I dialed a number I knew by heart, a number I hadn't called in almost a year. It rang twice in New York. George Patterson speaking. "George, it's Louis Coleman." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Louis, it's 3 o'clock in the morning here. This must be, is it?" "It's time, George," I said. A heavy silence stretched across the line. "Are you absolutely certain?" George's voice was all business now. "You know what this means? Clause 7B is the nuclear button. It cannot be undone. It means Terrell is." "I am certain," I said, my voice flat. "He just had his wife and in-laws try to move my wife and me into our own basement. He made his choice. Activate it immediately. I want him cut off by morning." "Consider it done," George said. "I'll need you and Diane in my office as soon as possible, 9 a.m. My team will prepare everything." "We'll be there," I said, and hung up. Diane was staring at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Clause 7B. Cut who off, Lou? You're frightening me. Who is George?" I sat down across from her. I had kept this secret for 40 years to protect her. Now I saw that in protecting her, I had left her defenseless. I owed her the truth. I had owed it to her for decades, George Patterson. I began is my attorney, my real attorney, not the local guy we use for our taxes. George is the head of my estate. Your estate, Diane, I said, taking her cold hands in mine. I have not been completely honest with you or with Terrell for a very, very long time. I told her everything. I told her about my architectural firm, how when I retired at 55, I didn't just retire. I had sold the firm. More accurately, I had sold my portfolio of structural design patents to an international conglomerate. I didn't just make enough to live on Diane. I confessed the old lie, tasting like ash in my mouth. I made a lot, more than I ever knew what to do with. How much, Louis? She whispered. The initial sale was for $24 million. After taxes, I put $20 million of it into a blind trust. I called it the Coleman Family Trust. Diane let out a small, strangled sound. 20 million. It's grown since then, honey. George manages it. It's closer to 35 million now. But why? She cried, pulling her hands away. It was a cry of betrayal, not of joy. Why would you hide this? Our life, the budgeting, the old car. Terrell. Why? Because of Terrell, I said. The sadness of it all finally hitting me. I saw what money did to my partner's kids. It made them soft. It made them entitled. It made them weak. I didn't want that for our boy. I wanted him to work. I wanted him to learn the value of $1. I wanted him to be a man, not an heir. So you played poor. I lived simply. I corrected her gently. I gave him everything he needed. His college was paid for by the trust. The down payment on his first apartment. That was the trust. I always told him it was the last of my savings. I truly thought I was teaching him responsibility. I stood up and walked to the window looking down at the city. But I was wrong. I wasn't teaching him responsibility. I was just hiding the target. I made him believe I was weak. I made him believe I was simple. I made him believe I was a burden. And he believed it. Diane was silent, trying to process 20 years of lies, trying to reconcile the man she married with the stranger sitting in this palace of a hotel room. So the house she finally asked, her voice small. The house they were measuring. The house they are trying to take. I turned to face her. That's the most important part, Diane. The house isn't ours. It never was. What do you mean? I said, feeling the first cold spark of justice. It belongs to the trust. We are just its lifelong tenants. And Terrell, he just tried to evict the landlord. The next morning, Diane and I arrived at George Patterson's office. Diane was still in the clothes from the night before. For her eyes red-rimmed and puffy, I, on the other hand, had called the hotel concierge at 6 a.m. and had a new $2,000 charcoal gray suit delivered to my room. When I walked out of the bedroom dressed, Diane gasped. She had never seen me in anything that wasn't off the rack. She was finally, after 45 years, beginning to see the man she had married. George's office was not a small, dusty law firm. It was on the 45th floor of the Wells Fargo Tower, a sprawling space of dark wood glass and expensive abstract art. The receptionist didn't even ask for our names. She simply stood as we entered. "Mr. Coleman, Mr. Patterson is waiting for you in the main conference room." Diane clutched my hand. This was a world she had never known I belonged to. We walked into a room with a 20-foot mahogany table. George stood at the far end overlooking the entire city. He wasn't just the friendly voice on the phone. Dressed in a sharp, pinstriped suit, he radiated an aura of absolute power. "Good morning, Louis Diane," George said, gesturing to the chairs. "I apologize for the circumstances, but I am glad you are finally here. We have a lot to cover and very little time." "George, what's going on?" Diane asked, her voice quiet. "Louis told me about the trust." "But why did Terrell act like that? It's not just the house, is it?" "No, Diane, it's not," George said grimly. He slid a thick, spiral-bound report across the table to me. I took the liberty of activating my investigators the moment Louis mentioned the possibility of activating Clause 7B. What you saw last night was not just disrespect. It was desperation, pure and simple. I opened the report. The first page was a summary of my son's finances. I felt the blood drain from my face. "My God," I whispered. "What is it?" Louis Diane asked, leaning over. I couldn't speak. I just turned the report so she could see the final number at the bottom of the page. "It is $750,000, she asked. "That George said is the amount of debt your son Terrell and his wife Heather are currently in." "But that's impossible," Diane protested. "Terrell has a wonderful job. He's a marketing director. He makes good money. He told us he makes $150,000 a year," George interrupted, "which is a respectable salary. The problem is his wife Heather spends $300,000 a year." He clicked a remote. The large screen on the wall lit up. It was a spreadsheet credit card statements, Neiman Marcus, Saks, Fifth Avenue. A lease payment for a new Maserati that Heather was driving. Mortgage payments on a condo they couldn't afford. "They are living a lie, Diane." I said, the pieces clicking into place. A complete, suffocating lie. "But the Prestons," Diane said, "Heather's parents, they're rich. Surely they're helping." "That's the worst part," George said, clicking to the next slide. "The Preston are rich, yes, but they are also frugal with their own money. They believe in appearances, but not in handouts. They expect Terrell, as the husband, to provide that lifestyle. Terrell, in an attempt to keep up with their expectations, has been drowning. He's taken out personal loans. He's maxed out 22 separate credit cards. He is, to put it plainly, about to lose everything." I looked at the numbers at the trips to Aspen, the jewelry purchases. This is why they were measuring my kitchen. I said, "They need the money from my house. They need it now." "It's worse than that," Louis George said. His voice dropped and the room felt suddenly colder. "What they did yesterday, that was not Plan A. That was Plan B." "Plan A," Diane whispered. George looked at me. "Louis, I didn't want to tell you this unless it became necessary. But 3 months ago, I received a call from the executive manager at the bank that handles the Coleman Trust." He clicked to a new document. It was a scanned copy of an email. 3 months ago, Terrell Coleman and his father-in-law, Richard Preston, scheduled a private meeting with the bank. They brought a lawyer of their own. They petitioned the bank to have the control of the trust's assets frozen. I stood up from my chair. They did what they attempted to have you, Lewis, legally declared mentally incompetent. Diane let out a small, horrified gasp. They presented a file, George continued, full of anecdotal evidence. How you forget things, how you live beneath your means, which they cited as a sign of senile hoarding, how you refuse to manage your own finances, letting them fall into disarray. But we live simply, Diane protested. That was our choice. It was a choice they tried to weaponize against you, George said. They argued that Lewis's refusal to live a life of luxury was proof that he was no longer sound of mind. They wanted the bank to grant Terrell emergency signatory power over the trust to protect his father's assets. They wanted the $35 million. I stated, the ice in my veins spreading. They wanted it all, George confirmed. And the bank, of course, laughed them out of the room. The trust is ironclad. It's designed to prevent exactly this. The bank manager knows you personally, Lewis. He knew it was a fraudulent claim, and as per the trust's security protocol, he called me immediately. I sat back down, the weight of the betrayal crushing me. This wasn't just a greedy son wanting a bigger house. This was a cold, calculated, premeditated conspiracy. My son had tried to have me locked away, to have my mind legally erased, so he could steal his inheritance. So yesterday, Diane said, connecting the final piece, yesterday was Plan B. I finished for her. When they failed to get the trust, they decided to go after the only asset they thought I actually owned, the house. They couldn't get the millions, so they settled for the $500,000 they thought the house was worth. They weren't just moving us to the basement, Diane said, her voice now hard as steel. They were moving us out of our lives one way or another. I looked at George. So he did it. He triggered Clause 7B. George Patterson smiled. He triggered it the moment he walked into that bank. 3 months ago. Lewis Terrell is already disinherited. He just doesn't know it yet. Diane's hands were shaking, but not from fear anymore. It was rage. A pure, cold rage I had never seen in her. They tried to have you committed, she whispered, her voice low and dangerous. They tried to lock you away. They did, I said, and they failed. So they came for the house. Those vultures, she hissed. Lewis, what does this mean? What happens now? I looked at George. Tell her exactly what Terrell just did to himself. George steepled his fingers, looking at Diane with a calm, professional respect. Diane, when Lewis and I set up this trust, he was worried about this exact scenario. He was worried that Terrell, surrounded by the wrong influences, might one day see him as a piggy bank rather than a father. So Lewis had me write in a very specific, very punitive clause. We call it Clause 7B. What does it do? Diane asked. We nicknamed it the wolf in sheep's clothing clause, George said. It states that if any primary beneficiary, in this case Terrell Coleman, is found to have engaged in any act of willful financial, emotional, or physical harm against the founders Lewis and Diane Coleman, that beneficiary is immediately and permanently disinherited. Diane's eyes widened. Permanently, irrevocably, as if he had never been named in the trust at all. George confirmed the attempt to have Lewis declared mentally incompetent, An act of profound financial and emotional harm triggered this clause 3 months ago. And yesterday he added, "Their hostile attempt to take your home and banish you to the basement was the final undeniable nail in his coffin." As of this moment, Terrell Coleman has no legal claim to a single penny of the $35 million Coleman Family Trust. The words hung in the air. $35 million lost. Diane processed this. "So what happens to the money to the house? Where does it all go?" "It goes," George said to the contingent beneficiary, the person Louis designated to inherit everything in the event of Terrell's disqualification. I smiled. Monique. "Diane," said surprised. "Your sister's girl." "My sister's daughter," I affirmed. "The one who works as a public school nurse in Atlanta. The one who calls us every single Sunday just to check in. The one who still sends you a handmade card for your birthday, Diane." George nodded. "I called Monique this morning. I explained the situation. She was shocked, to say the least, but she understands. She is flying in tonight. As of this moment, your niece is the legal heir to the entire estate, including the house at 124 Willow Creek." A heavy silence fell as we absorbed the sheer scale of the shift. Then a slow, cold smile spread across my face. "He doesn't know," I whispered. "No," George said. "He has no idea. He just thinks he's dealing with a tired old man who lives in a house he can steal. They want the house." I set a plan forming in my mind. "They are so desperate for that $500,000. They are willing to destroy our lives for it." So I said, looking at George, "Let's give it to them." Diane looked at me. "Louis, what are you talking about, the trap, Diane? They set their trap, now we set ours." George caught on immediately. His eyes lit up. "Oh, that is brilliant, Louis. Diabolical and perfectly legal." "What are you two planning?" Diane asked, her voice a mix of fear and excitement. George leaned forward. "Your family. Diane thinks you are weak, old, and senile. They think they've won. They think Louis ran away last night like a scared dog. They are arrogant, greedy, and stupid. We are going to use that arrogance against them. We are going to draft a new document, a transfer of property and care agreement. It will look official," I added. "It will say that we, Louis and Diane Coleman, in our frail state, agree to hand over the deed to the house in exchange." George continued, "For Terrell and Heather, assuming all responsibility for our care. They won't be able to sign it fast enough, but the fine print, Diane, the fine print will be a work of art. What will it say? It will say." George beamed that they, Terrell and Heather Coleman, along with their witnesses, Richard and Barbara Preston, do hereby acknowledge and confirm that Louis and Diane Coleman are in a vulnerable state, suffering from diminished capacity, and are unable to make their own financial and personal decisions. It will state that they are willingly and knowingly assuming control of all assets for this reason. It's not a transfer. It's a confession, a signed, witnessed, notarized confession of conspiracy and elder abuse. My heart was pounding now, not with fear, but with a cold, righteous fury. "It's perfect," I said. "They'll be so blinded by the prize they will sign their own death warrant." "Let's do it," Diane said, her voice firm. I picked up my phone. My hand was steady. I dialed Terrell's number. He answered on the first ring. He must have been staring at his phone, panicking. "Dad." Dad, where are you? Mom, is she okay? We've been so worried. His voice was a perfect imitation of a concerned son. It made me sick. I let out a long, weary sigh. I made my voice tremble. Terrell, son. Dad. What's wrong? Your mother and I were at a lawyer's office, I said, playing the part of a broken, defeated man. We've been talking all night. And maybe you're right, son. I heard a sharp intake of breath on his end. Silence. What do you mean, Dad? He asked, his voice cautious, not daring to hope. We're old, I said, letting my voice crack. Diane is a wreck. I can't fight this anymore. You said you'd take care of us. You said you'd handle everything. The house, it's too much. Oh, Dad, he breathed. The relief in his voice was disgusting. Yes, of course. We'll take care of everything. You're doing the right thing. I promise. Good, I said. Then I need you to come down to the lawyer's office, George Patterson, in the Wells Fargo Tower. I want to sign the house over to you officially. Let's just get this over with. There was a pause. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the greed overwhelming any tiny speck of caution. You're serious, he whispered. You'll sign the house over today. Yes, I said. 2:00 p.m. Bring Heather and bring her parents. They seem to be involved. I want everyone here, as witnesses, so it's all legal. Yes. Yes, Dad, absolutely. His voice was bright, triumphant. We'll be there 2 p.m. Don't you worry about a thing. We'll take care of you from now on. I know you will, son, I said. I know you will. I hung up the phone. I looked at Diane, her face pale but resolute. I looked at George, who was already dictating the terms of the agreement to his assistant. He's hooked, I said. George smiled. The trap is set. At precisely 2:00 in the afternoon, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. My son Terrell and his wife Heather entered first. They were followed closely by her parents Richard and Barbara Preston. They were not the same people from the night before. They had gone home showered and dressed for what they clearly believed was their coronation day. Terrell wore his most expensive-looking suit, a navy blue one I'm sure was bought on credit. Heather was in a bright white pantsuit looking like a triumphant CEO about to close a major deal. Barbara Preston was dripping in gold jewelry, her smile sharp and predatory. Richard just looked smug, as if he had personally orchestrated this entire victory. Dad, Terrell said, walking over and placing a hand on my shoulder. His hand felt heavy, proprietary. I'm so glad you're seeing reason. This is for the best for everyone. Heather glided over to Diane. Mother Diane, she said, her voice dripping with fake honey. You look so tired, poor thing. Don't you worry. From now on, we'll handle everything. You won't have to lift a finger. You won't regret this. Let's get this over with. Richard Preston announced, pulling out a chair at the head of the table as if he owned the place. We have celebratory dinner reservations at 7. George Patterson, ever the professional, gestured for them to sit. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As Mr. Coleman expressed to his son, he and Mrs. Coleman have had a long night of discussion and have come to a significant decision. He slid 4 thick, professionally bound documents across the polished mahogany table. This, George said, is the care and property transfer agreement. It's a comprehensive document. Heather's eyes were practically glued to the cover sheet. She was vibrating with impatience. Let me summarize the key points. George continued, his voice a calm, legal monotone. The agreement states that Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Coleman, the founders, agree to transfer the full deed and title of the property at 124 Willow Creek to Mr. and Mrs. Terrell Coleman. Heather let out a small, sharp sigh of relief. In exchange, George went on, Mr. and Mrs. Terrell Coleman agreed to provide comprehensive lifetime care for the founders. This includes, but is not limited to, housing, medical supervision, and all financial management. Yes, absolutely, we agree, Heather said, reaching for the pen in the center of the table. 100%. Where do we sign? George held up a hand. Patience, Mrs. Coleman. We must do this by the book. There are several signature pages. He turned to Richard and Barbara. And since you, Mr. and Mrs. Preston, were present during the initial family discussion last night and are here today, we would be grateful if you would sign as official witnesses to this agreement. Witnesses, of course, Richard said, puffing out his chest. Excellent, George said. Your signatures will be on page 8. It's just a standard witness attestation. It verifies that you are present, that you are party to this agreement, and that you can attest to the founders' state of mind. Their state of mind? Barbara asked, her smile tightening. Yes, George said smoothly, flipping through the pages. Right here. By signing, you attest that you have personally observed and agree that Lewis and Diane Coleman are now in a state requiring dedicated supervision and are making this decision based on their acknowledged inability to manage their own affairs. Richard and Barbara looked at each other and smiled. They thought this was brilliant. They thought this legally cemented their argument that we were senile. Of course, Richard said, nodding. We are happy to attest to that. We've been saying it for months. They are clearly in need of supervision. Wonderful, George said. Then please let's begin. He passed the first copy to Heather. She didn't even open it. She flipped directly to the last page and signed her name with a flourish. Terrell followed his signature, messier, more nervous, but just as fast. They didn't read a single word. They didn't read the clauses confirming their acknowledgement of our diminished capacity. They didn't read the fine print detailing their willingness to assume control. They just signed. Then George passed the next 2 copies to Richard and Barbara. They too flipped to page 8 and proudly signed their names as witnesses legally attesting to our incompetence. Finally, George slid the last copy to me and Diane. I looked at Diane. Her hand was steady. She picked up the heavy, expensive pen. She signed her name. Then I signed mine. George gathered all 4 copies, stacking them neatly. Well, he said, tapping them on the table. That seems to be everything. Heather stood up, beaming. She clapped her hands together once. Perfect. Well, that's that. Terrell, darling, we need to call the contractors. They can start on the master bedroom tomorrow. She turned to me. Dad, Mom, we'll help you start packing your things for the basement as soon as we get home. It will be so much cozier for you down there. Terrell looked relieved, as if the weight of the world, or at least $750,000 of it, had been lifted from his shoulders. I let the silence hang for a moment. I watched them bask in their victory. I saw the greed, the relief, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance. I let them enjoy it for a full 10 seconds. Then I looked at George. He nodded. Actually, I said, my voice clear and strong, cutting through Heather's happy chatter. We're not quite finished yet. Heather's smile faltered. What do you mean we signed everything you did? I agreed. But there's just one small logistical problem with the document you just signed. A minor detail, really. Richard Preston narrowed his eyes. What detail? I leaned forward. The house, I don't actually own it. Heather's triumphant, beaming face was a picture of pure greed. Richard Preston looked smug. He felt he had just successfully brokered the deal of a lifetime, securing his daughter's future by helping to dispose of her inconvenient in-laws. Actually, Mrs. Coleman, you are not quite finished yet, George said. His voice had changed. The friendly, accommodating tone was gone. In its place was a sharp, cold precision. The voice of a lawyer who was no longer negotiating, but dictating. Heather, who was already turning toward the door, stopped. What do you mean we signed the papers? It's done. I mean, George said, there is a small technical problem with the care and property transfer agreement you just signed. Richard Preston let out an impatient, condescending sigh. What problem? It's a standard transfer agreement. I'm a lawyer myself, Patterson, or at least I was. I know how these things work. Do you now? George asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, Richard said dismissively. We checked the county records before we even came here. The property at 124 Willow Creek is registered to Lewis Coleman. He just signed his rights over. It's finished. Let's go, George, Patterson smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a hunter who had just watched the wolf walk right into a steel trap. That's where you are fundamentally wrong, Mr. Preston. You checked the public records, but you didn't, or rather couldn't check the trust records. You see, Mr. Coleman's name is indeed on that deed, but it's listed only as the trust manager. The air in the room crackled. Terrell, who had been looking relieved, now looked confused. What are you talking about? What trust? The actual legal and indisputable owner of that property, George continued, and has been for the past 20 years, is the Coleman Family Trust. The what? Heather's voice was a high-pitched squeak. The Coleman Family Trust, I said, speaking up for the first time since they had entered. My trust, the one I established in 2005, right after I sold my company. Terrell looked at me, his face a mask of total blank confusion. You have a trust. What, like a small bank account for retirement? No, son, I said, leaning forward. Not like a small bank account. Like all the bank accounts. Barbara Preston let out a short, ugly laugh. A trust? Don't be ridiculous. You live in that sad little house. You drive that 10-year-old car. You're just a retired architect. What could you possibly have in a trust? A few $1,000s. This is a pathetic waste of our time. I looked at Barbara. I let her arrogance, her complete and total misjudgment hang in the air. I let her feel superior for one last glorious second. George asked, my voice calm. What is the current valuation of the Coleman Family Trust? George looked down at a different folder, a thick one they had not seen before. As of this morning's market open, Mr. Coleman, the trust's liquid and fixed assets are valued at $35,421,000 and change. The silence that followed was so profound. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. I could hear Diane let out a shaky breath beside me. She knew, but hearing the numbers said out loud in this room was still a shock. Terrell just stared at me. His mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. Richard Preston's smug, fleshy face dissolved. He looked like he had been physically struck. 35 million. But the most beautiful reaction, the one I will treasure, was Heather's. Her face went through a rapid series of emotions. First complete confusion, then total disbelief, then a wild, ecstatic, all-consuming joy. Her eyes lit up like a Christmas tree. 35 million. She breathed, looking at Terrell, her voice trembling. Baby, we're rich. She actually started to laugh, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that was half sob. He has $35 million. Oh my God. Terrell, we're rich. She launched herself at Terrell, who was still paralyzed, throwing her arms around his neck. We're rich. We don't need the stupid house. Who cares about the house? We get the trust. She pulled away from him and turned to me, her entire demeanor changing in an instant. The fake honey was gone, replaced by a frantic, desperate, clawing adoration. Dad. Oh, Dad. I mean, Louis, I knew it. I always knew you were special. I always told Terrell your father is such a dignified man, so wise. I stop. My voice was cold. It cut through her hysterical rambling and stopped her mid-sentence. What? She asked, her smile faltering. You're not rich, I said. He's not rich. You get nothing. She froze. What do you mean, Terrell? He's your son, he's the beneficiary. He was, I said. But the agreement, Heather stammered, pointing frantically at the documents on the table. We signed. We have a deal. Ah, yes, George Patterson said, picking up the stack of papers they had so eagerly signed. He held them up. The care and property transfer agreement. Thank you for this. It is an incredibly valuable document. Heather looked at her father, confused. See, it's valuable. Oh, it is. George agreed. But not as a transfer of property. As I said, that part is completely void since Louis doesn't own the house he was transferring to you. No, this document is valuable as a confession. Richard Preston's face went from pale to a sickly gray. I finally understood. A confession, Terrell whispered. Yes, I said, looking right at my son. You, your wife, and your in-laws have just signed a legally binding document attested to by witnesses stating that you all believe I am mentally incompetent, that you believe I am suffering from diminished capacity, and that you are conspiring to take control of my assets based on that belief. You just handed me all the proof I will ever need for a court of law. Terrell stared at the papers, then at me, and then at George. The color was draining from his face, only to be replaced by a dark, ugly flush of anger. So what? He suddenly shouted, slamming his flat palm on the mahogany table. The sound made Heather jump and Diane flinched. So what? It's a stupid piece of paper. It's a trick. It doesn't mean anything. He turned his wild eyes on me, his voice pitching higher, cracking with panic. You can't do this. I am your son. I am your only son. I am the beneficiary. That trust, that $35 million, it's mine. You can't just take it away from me. He can't. Right, Richard. Tell them. He was looking at me, but he was pleading to his wife, to his in-laws, trying to reassure them, trying to reassure himself. It's my birthright. You were the beneficiary, Terrell, I said. My voice was quiet. The calm in the room seemed to terrify him more than any shouting could. You were the beneficiary right up until 10:15 a.m. on Tuesday, August 12th, 3 months ago. Terrell froze. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? I asked. August 12th, a meeting at the First National Trust Bank. You, your father-in-law, Richard here, and a lawyer from his firm. Does that ring a bell? Terrell's face went slack. He looked like he had been shot. How did you know about that, the bank? They said it was a confidential inquiry. They called me George Patterson, interjected, his voice like ice. The moment you left the building, as the administrator of the Coleman Trust, I am legally obligated to investigate any hostile inquiries or attempts to seize control of the assets. Hostile inquiries, Terrell stammered, grasping for a defense. I was just asking questions. I was worried about him, about his state. You were not asking questions, Terrell, I said, finally standing up. I felt tall. I felt powerful. You were making accusations. You told the board members that I was senile. You told them I was hoarding. You claimed my simple private lifestyle was proof of advanced mental decay and a danger to myself and the estate. You brought a lawyer and you petitioned the board to have me declared mentally incompetent and to grant you emergency signatory power over all $35 million. The George said was a profound tactical error, because that singular act of profound willful betrayal triggered Clause 7. Clause 7B. Heather whispered, her face ashen. What is Clause 7B? That I said is the part of the trust I prayed to God I would never have to use. I walked around the table until I was standing right in front of my son. He was shaking. When I set up this trust, I knew your heart, Terrell. I knew it was good, but I also knew your weakness. I knew you were easily influenced. I knew you desperately wanted to be liked by people, like them. I gestured to the Preston. People who only value what things cost. So I had George build a defense mechanism into the very heart of the trust. A fail-safe, a poison pill. We call it the wolf in sheep's clothing clause. Diane, who had been silent, spoke her first word since they had entered. Her voice was cold. Explain it. It states, I said, looking directly into Terrell's terrified eyes, in very simple, ironclad legal terms, that if the primary beneficiary Terrell Coleman, or any person acting in concert with him, like his wife or his in-laws, is found to have committed willful financial, emotional, or physical harm against me or your mother, that beneficiary is immediately, automatically, and permanently disinherited, as if he had never been named in the first place. Permanent, Diane echoed. It was a judgment. The moment you sat in that bank and tried to have me erased from my own life, Terrell, I said you erased yourself from my legacy. You get nothing. Not the house, not the savings, not a single penny of the trust. Not now, not ever. The words settled in the room like dust. Richard Preston was the first to react, sputtering, his legal mind grasping for a loophole. This is outrageous. It's coercion. It's a contract of adhesion. It won't stand up in court. We'll fight this. George Patterson actually chuckled. A cold, dry sound. Fight it with what, Mr. Preston? It already has stood up. The trust was vetted against this exact challenge by 2 federal courts when it was drafted. It is ironclad. Your client disqualified himself 3 months ago with his own actions. George held up the stack of papers they had just signed. And to make matters worse, he and all of you just signed a full notarized confession, admitting to the very acts that disqualify him. The game is over. You lost. And that was when Heather understood the house was nothing, the taunt, $35 million. The fantasy. The entire reason she was in this room, the entire basis of her marriage. It was all gone. It had never been hers. She looked at Terrell, her face a mask of pure reptilian hatred. "You idiot!" she hissed at him. "You failed!" And then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed, sliding gracelessly out of her expensive chair and onto the Persian rug in a dead faint. Heather was still on the floor, propped up on one elbow. Her expensive, white pantsuit was smudged with dust from the rug. Richard and Barbara Preston were frozen in their chairs, their faces a sickly shade of gray, looking like statues in a museum of their own arrogance. Terrell, my son, was the only one moving. He was shaking his head over and over as if he could physically deny the words he had just heard. He ignored his fainted wife. He ignored his stunned in-laws. He only looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate childish panic. "No," he whispered. "No, if not me, then who?" His voice cracked. "Who gets it? Who gets the house? Who gets everything? It doesn't just disappear, does it?" He looked around the room as if the $35 million was a physical object, a trophy that had been promised to him, and he was terrified it had just vanished. I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. I simply turned my head and nodded to George. "George, I believe our other guest is waiting. Would you please ask her to join us?" George pressed a small button on the conference room intercom. "You can come in now, Monique." The side door, the one leading to George's private office, opened. A young woman walked in. She was about 30 years old, wearing simple blue nurse's scrubs. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face was kind but etched with a deep sadness. It was my niece, Monique, my sister's daughter. Terrell's head snapped toward her, his confusion instantly curdled into a new, raw, burning rage. "Monique! What the hell are you doing here? This is a private family meeting. Get out." On the floor. Heather had managed to sit up. Her hair was a mess and her makeup was starting to run. She saw Monique, and her face twisted in contempt. "The nurse, what is she doing here? Is she here to check on our blood pressure? Get her out." Monique stopped a few feet from the table. She looked at Terrell with anger, but with a profound, steely pity. "Hello, Terrell. I'm here because Uncle Lewis and Aunt Diane asked me to be." "She is here," George Patterson said, his voice cutting through the tension, as the contingent beneficiary of the Coleman family trust. Terrell just stared. The what? "As of 9 a.m. this morning," George continued, "upon your legal and permanent disqualification under Clause 7B, the status of primary beneficiary was dissolved. As per the Trust's bylaws, all assets, rights, and titles transfer immediately to the contingent beneficiary. In this case, Ms. Monique Johnson." George looked at Monique and nodded. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, Monique is the sole heir to the entire $35 million estate." The silence in the room was absolute. Heather, still on the floor, made a small, choking sound. Richard Preston looked like he was having a heart attack. Terrell just shook his head, a wild, broken laugh escaping his lips. You're giving it all to her. A part-time nurse from Atlanta. This is a joke. This is the sickest joke I have ever heard." "It is not a joke," Terrell, Monique said. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room. She stepped forward and placed a single crisp legal document on the table directly in front of him. It landed with a soft, final thud. "What is this?" Terrell whispered, afraid to touch it. "As the new legal administrator for the trust," Monique said, "which, as you now know, is the sole owner of the property at 124 Willow Creek. This is a formal legal notice of eviction." Heather scrambled to her feet, her white suit now rumpled and pathetic. "Eviction? You can't evict us. That's our house." "No, Heather," Monique said, looking her dead in the eye for the first time. "It is my house now. Or rather, it belongs to the trust which I manage on behalf of my aunt and uncle. You and Terrell were living there as guests. Last night you attempted to evict the rightful tenants and move them to the basement. You are no longer guests." She tapped the paper. "This notice gives you and your husband, Terrell Coleman, exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises." 24 hours. Terrell exploded, finding his voice. "That's insane. We have things there. Our furniture. Our lives are in that house. You have 24 hours to remove your personal movable belongings." Monique stated, her voice like steel. "Anything left in the house after 2 p.m. tomorrow, including your wife's blueprints for her marble island and your father-in-law's tape measure, will be considered abandoned property. It will be immediately liquidated and the proceeds donated to a charity for the elderly. The locks on all doors will be changed at 2:01 p.m. tomorrow." "You bitch!" Heather shrieked, and she actually lunged across the table. "I would not do that, Mrs. Coleman," George said calmly, stepping directly into her path, without even flinching. "You are already facing potential criminal charges for conspiracy to commit elder fraud. Adding assault to that list would be, and I use the legal term here, exceptionally stupid." Heather stopped. Her hand raised, her face a mask of ugly, impotent rage. As of this moment, Monique said, "You are all trespassing in this office, and if you set foot on the property at 124 Willow Creek again, without my or my aunt and uncle's express written permission, I will have you arrested." Terrell ignored her. He ignored everyone. He stumbled past George, past the table, until he was standing right in front of me. His face was a wreck of tears, snot, and sweat. Her, he choked out, jabbing a finger toward Monique. Over me, her. Why, Dad? I am your son. I'm your blood. She's just your sister's kid. I looked at my son. My heart was heavy. Not with anger anymore, but with a vast, empty sadness. You're right, Terrell. I said you're my blood. But I turned and gestured to Monique, who is now standing beside Diane, holding her hand. She is my family. She is the one who calls Diane every Sunday just to talk. She is the one who remembers my birthday, not with a text message, but with a handwritten card. She is the one who, when Diane had her knee surgery 2 years ago, flew in on her own dime and sat by her hospital bed for 3 days sleeping in a chair without asking for a single thing in return. You are my son, Terrell, but she is my family. I looked him in the eye. You are just a disappointment. Richard Preston. His face a mask of purple rage, finally understood that the game was over. He was a man who detested losing, and he had just been checkmated in front of his entire family. He grabbed his wife Barbara by the arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. This is preposterous, he sputtered, yanking his suit jacket straight. A complete farce. We will not stay here to be insulted by this nurse and a senile old man who thinks he's a king. He's right. Barbara chimed in frantically, brushing imaginary dust from her expensive silk blouse. We are leaving. Terrell, Heather, get your things. We don't need this charity. We have our own money. We certainly don't need his $35 million. They moved toward the door. A pathetic attempt to regain control, to make it seem as if they were rejecting us and not the other way around. Heather, seeing her parents bluster, began to rally. She grabbed Terrell's arm. Let's go, Terrell. We'll fight this. We'll sue them. We don't need them. Oh, but I'm afraid you do, Mr. Preston. George's voice, smooth as glass, cut them off. They stopped their hands just inches from the brass doorknob. Excuse me, Richard sneered, turning slowly. I said, George repeated. I'm afraid you do need them. Or rather, you needed his money. Please sit back down. We haven't finished the presentation. We have nothing more to discuss, Richard growled. On the contrary, George replied, pressing a button on the small remote in his hand. The large projector screen that had been recessed in the ceiling hummed to life, descending silently. You all came here today under the pretense of caring for Louis and Diane. We are simply trying to understand the full depth of that concern. The screen lit up, displaying a document titled in large, bold letters, Liability Report, Coleman, Terrell, and Heather. Terrell and Heather froze. What is this? Terrell demanded, his voice rising in panic. You have no right. That's private. It was private, George corrected him. Until you made it the trust's business by attempting to defraud it. As the administrator, I have a fiduciary duty to protect the trust from all credible threats. And you, Mr. Coleman, along with your accomplices, have become the most significant threat of all. He aimed the red dot of a laser pointer at the screen. You see, we were deeply curious about why you were so desperate. Why try to have your father committed? Why risk everything for this $500,000 house? The $35 million was the obvious prize, but the house that was a smaller, more desperate move. It implied a severe cash flow problem. George clicked the remote. A long list of credit card accounts filled the screen. American Express, Platinum, Chase, Sapphire, Reserve, Visa. Black 22 different cards in total. You two, George said, addressing Terrell and Heather directly, are living a spectacular lie. Your combined income before taxes is approximately $150,000 per year. That is none of your business. Heather snapped, her face pale. It is now, George said. Because your combined spending according to these statements from the last 12 months was just over $35,000, a deficit of $155,000. But of course it gets much worse. He clicked again. A new slide showed personal loans, payday advances, and applications for a second mortgage on their condo. Add it all together, George said, his voice echoing in the silent room. Your current unsecured high-interest debt totals $754,212.90. What? The voice was not Terrell's. It was Heather's. She turned to her husband, her face bone white with a dawning, sickening horror. 700,000? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Terrell couldn't look at her. He was staring at the screen, at the numbers that represented his total ruin. All of it exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. You told me it was 200. She shrieked, her voice cracking. You told me it was a single bad business loan. You lied to me. Terrell finally looked at her, his face crumbling. I was going to fix it. I just needed one big win. I thought. You thought what Heather screamed, tears of rage now streaming down her face. You thought you'd steal my father-in-law's house to pay for your... What is this? This, George said helpfully, clicking to the next slide, is a detailed transaction history from 6 different offshore online sports betting sites. It appears, Mr. Coleman, that the vast majority of this debt isn't from buying your wife expensive bags. It's from gambling. You've gambled away nearly $500,000 you never had. Heather looked like she was going to be physically ill. She backed away from Terrell as if he were contaminated. Richard Preston, however, looked almost relieved. He saw an opening to distance himself. A gambler, he said, his voice dripping with theatrical disgust. My God, Barbara, can you believe it? This con artist married our daughter. He played us all. Barbara agreed, clutching at her pearls. He was going to drag our poor Heather down with him. The liar. But that's not entirely true, is it? George said, his voice dangerously soft. Richard and Barbara froze. What do you mean? Richard asked. George clicked the remote. The screen changed. Now it read, Preston, Richard and Barbara Financial Inquiry. What is this? Barbara stammered, her fake indignation vanishing. You have no right to our finances. Again, I do, George said. The moment you signed that document as witnesses to a fraudulent act, you legally made yourselves accomplices in this conspiracy. I had to know why a supposedly wealthy man like you, Richard, would risk his entire reputation on such a flimsy, illegal scheme. Unless, of course, you were just as desperate as your son-in-law. The screen lit up with new data. It seems your boutique hedge fund, Mr. Preston, isn't doing so well. In fact, it's been under active investigation by the SEC for serious capital irregularities for the last 6 months. Richard Preston stopped breathing. My investigators found that you have been borrowing heavily from your clients' trust accounts to cover your own catastrophic market losses. George said, "You're not just broke, Richard. You're insolvent, and you are about to be indicted." "You monster!" Barbara shrieked, turning on her husband. "You told me the business was fine. You said you were a genius. And you—" Richard roared back, his face purple. "You told me your mother gave you that money. That's a lie." "Oh, isn't it?" George said, clicking one last time. "And you, Barbara, that generous help you gave your daughter the money. For her Maserati, the down payment on the condo, that wasn't from your husband's successful business. We traced the transactions. You have been systematically draining your own 88-year-old mother's retirement account, without her knowledge. An account, I might add, that she kept at our bank. You common thief." Richard howled at his wife. "You're one to talk. You fraud." It all fell apart right there. The screaming, the accusations, the raw, ugly truth of their lives exploding in the middle of George's conference room. It was beautiful. George Patterson let them implode for a full minute. A symphony of destruction. Then he cleared his throat. "It seems," he said, turning off the screen, plunging the room back into a heavy silence, "that you weren't a healthy family trying to help an old man. You were a house of cards already collapsing, and you were all trying to use Louis and Diane as your foundation. The meeting is over." The heavy silence in the room stretched for a full 10 seconds. It was broken by Heather. She hadn't fainted. She had been calculating. She slowly, very slowly, got to her feet, her face pale, her eyes fixed on my son Terrell. "You," she whispered. Her voice was no longer sweet or faked. It was a low reptilian hiss. You lying, worthless fraud." Terrell, who was still staring at the blank screen where his $35 million had just vanished, flinched. "What, Heather? I didn't lie. I thought," she shrieked, her voice suddenly climbing into a hysterical register that made everyone wise. "You thought you told me your family was old money. You told me your father was modest and eccentric. You told me this house was just the beginning. I was trying to give you what you wanted." Terrell yelled back, his desperation finally finding an outlet in anger. "I was trying to keep up. Who was the one who needed the Maserati, who had to have the condo in the city, who spent $10,000 on a single handbag last week?" "Because you told me we could afford it," she screamed, taking a step toward him, her hands clenched into fists. "I was trying to make it work. I was managing it. Managing it." Barbara Preston, who had recovered from her own shock, stood up. Her voice was dripping with venom. "You call $750,000 in gambling debts managing it. You are a degenerate, Terrell. You married our daughter under false pretenses. You are a common con artist." "Oh, I'm the con artist." Terrell laughed, a high, broken, terrible sound. "Your husband is a crook. He's about to be indicted by the SEC. And you," he jabbed a finger at Barbara, "you stole from your own 88-year-old mother. You're a pack of hypocrites, a family of vampires." Richard Preston let out a roar and lunged across the table. "You ungrateful little I'll kill you, gentlemen." George Patterson's voice was not loud, but it cut through the chaos like a whip. He stood between Richard and Terrell. "That is enough. The room fell silent again, the air vibrating with raw hatred. "This," George said, gesturing to the four of them with complete disgust, "is a place of business. It is my office. You will not turn it into a whatever this is. The meeting, as I stated before, is over. The trust is secure. The documents are signed. Now I must insist that you take your family disputes elsewhere immediately." Heather wasn't looking at her parents. She wasn't looking at George. She was just staring at Terrell, and I could see the final cold calculations clicking into place behind her eyes. This wasn't just anger anymore. It was grief, but she wasn't grieving the man. She was grieving the money. "So that's it," Terrell whispered, his voice hollow. He saw it too. It was always just the money. Heather, busy gathering her expensive purse, ignored him. "You never loved me," Terrell said a little louder. "You loved this." He gestured around the opulent office. "You loved the idea of this, the 35 million. Heather finally stopped. She turned to face him. Her face was cold, composed, and stripped of all emotion. All the fake love, all the honeyed words. "Well, he was rich," she said, her voice flat. "And you were too stupid to even inherit it correctly. You couldn't even manage that one simple thing right." That was the bullet. I watched my son absorb it. I saw the last spark of the weak, desperate boy who had tried so hard to please her just die. He straightened up. He looked at her, truly looked at her as if for the very first time. "You are a monster," he whispered. Heather just laughed. A short, ugly, humorless bark. "No, Terrell. I'm just practical. And you turned out to be a very, very bad investment." She turned to her parents. "Let's go. I need a drink. I need to call my lawyer." "Wait," Terrell said. She turned back, her face a mask of irritation. "What now? Are you going to beg?" "It won't work." Terrell slowly, deliberately held up his left hand. "You forgot this." He twisted the simple gold wedding band off his finger. It was my own father's ring, the one I had given him when he told me he was getting married. He looked at it, then threw it on the polished floor. It skittered across the mahogany and came to rest right at her designer shoes. "I'm divorcing you," he said. Heather looked down at the ring. Then she looked back at him. She laughed again. That same horrible, brittle laugh. "Divorce me? You can't afford to divorce me, you fool. Wait." She stopped. The final, terrible realization hit her. There's nothing to take." "Exactly," I said from my chair. Heather's face crumpled. The last shred of her composure shattered into pure, unadulterated fury. She ripped the massive, glittering diamond ring, the one he had bought her, with a fraudulent loan, off her own finger. "Fine!" she screamed. "You want it? Have it!" She didn't throw it on the floor. She threw it directly at his face. Terrell ducked, and the ring, worth a fortune, he never had, hit the glass conference room wall behind him with a sharp tank. "I would rather go home and live with my criminal parents." She spat, her voice thick with venom, then spend one more second breathing the same air as a broke, pathetic failure like you. She grabbed Barbara's arm. "Let's go. I'm calling my lawyer." I want an annulment." Barbara, looking completely defeated and 10 years older, let her daughter pull her from the room. Richard Preston was the last to leave. He didn't look at his wife or daughter. He stopped at the door, turned and looked right at me. His eyes were cold, dead, and full of a hatred that was almost tangible. "You," he growled, his voice low, "you enjoyed this. You planned this whole thing, this entire humiliation." "No, Richard," I said, meeting his gaze. "I didn't plan. I just lived my life quietly. You planned. You conspired. You were the ones who were arrogant. I just had a better emergency exit." He stared at me for a long, terrible moment, the promise of future battles hanging in the air between us. Then he turned and followed his family out of the office, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place echoed in the sudden, profound silence. The heavy glass door clicked shut, and the room was plunged into a sudden, thick silence. The echoes of Heather's screaming and Richard's threats seemed to be sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum. They were all gone. The Prestons with their fake wealth and real cruelty. Heather with her venom and her ambition. They had vanished like a bad dream. The only one left was Terrell. He hadn't left. He couldn't. He was a heap on the floor by the conference room door. A 38-year-old man in a rumpled suit sobbing into his hands. He was a man who had just lost his wife, his in-laws, his house, and a $35 million fortune. All in the span of 15 minutes, he was completely, utterly, and finally alone. Diane let out a long, shaky breath and sat down heavily in her chair. Monique, my niece, moved quietly to stand behind her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. George Patterson. My lawyer showed no emotion at all. He walked calmly back to the head of the table. He picked up the signed 10-page care and property transfer agreement, the confession, and tapped it neatly against the table. He placed it carefully into a new, unmarked folder. Terrell didn't move. He just knelt on the expensive rug, his shoulders shaking with these awful, gasping, choked sobs. They were the sounds of a child who finally understands, far too late, that he is in terrible, irreversible trouble. I wanted to feel something. Pity, anger, anything. But I just felt empty. I felt a vast, aching sadness for the boy I had raised and the man he had failed to become. I let him cry for a long, heavy minute. He needed to feel the absolute bottom of the pit he had dug for himself. Finally, George cleared his throat. "Mr. Coleman." Terrell flinched at the formal name. He slowly, painfully pushed himself up from the floor. His face was a wreck, red and swollen, his suit stained with his own tears. He looked at George, his eyes wild with terror. "Please," Terrell whispered. His voice was hoarse. Just let me go. I'll leave. I'll go to a motel. I won't bother you again. I have nothing. It's over." George Patterson stared at him, his face impassive. "You are mistaken, Mr. Coleman. You still have a great many things." Terrell looked confused. "What, you have criminal liabilities," George stated. Terrell's head snapped up. What are you talking about? It's over. It's a family matter, an inheritance thing. You won. You took it all. This was never a meeting about an inheritance. Terrell George said, his voice dropping, becoming the sharp, clinical voice of a prosecutor. This was a meeting to finalize the evidence against you. You seem to be under the impression that this ends here. It does not. It ends in a courtroom. Evidence for what? For what? George actually pulled a new yellow legal pad from his briefcase and clicked his pen. Let's list them, shall we, first? He said. Conspiracy to commit felony elder fraud. You, your wife, and your in-laws conspired to deprive your parents of their legal property by making fraudulent claims of mental incompetence. He held up the stack of papers they had all signed. A charge to which you have all very helpfully just confessed to in writing with witnesses. Terrell began to shake a visible tremor that started in his hands. No, we just thought second. George continued writing on the pad. Attempted wire and bank fraud, a federal offense. 3 months ago, you and Richard Preston personally petitioned the First National Trust Bank to gain control of the Coleman Trust's assets, making false claims about your father's mental state. The bank's security footage is excellent. The manager's testimony is even better. I was just worried about him, Terrell pleaded. Third, George went on, ignoring him. Forgery, attempting to access bank funds using what you believe to be your father's authority. And finally, my personal favorite, felony elder abuse. You intentionally and systematically inflicted profound emotional and mental distress on your parents, both citizens over the age of 65, for the explicit purpose of financial gain. In this state that carries a mandatory minimum prison sentence. The word hung in the air. Prison. Terrell's face went from pale to a sickly greenish white. He wasn't crying anymore. He looked like he was going to be sick. Jail, he whispered, his voice cracking. You're talking about jail. I'm talking about prison. Terrell George said, his voice like ice. Men like Richard Preston, white-collar criminals, they get prison. But men like you, who gamble away $750,000 and then try to defraud their elderly parents to cover it up. Judges are not kind to men like you. Terrell's legs buckled, and he collapsed back into the nearest chair. He didn't look at George. He didn't look at Diane. He turned his wide, terrified, pleading eyes to me. Dad, he choked out. Dad, please. You wouldn't. He stumbled out of the chair and fell to his knees in front of me. He grabbed the legs of my new suit. Dad, please. You wouldn't send your son to prison. You wouldn't do that. It was Heather. It was her parents. They put those ideas in my head. They told me it was normal. I was desperate. Love you, Dad. I've always loved you. Please don't do this. I looked down at the 38-year-old man sobbing at my feet. You love me, I repeated. The words felt like gravel in my mouth. You tried to have me declared insane and locked away in a nursing home. Terrell, is that what love looks like to you? You stood in my kitchen in my house and you told me I should just accept being moved to the basement. I didn't. He sobbed. I was scared. You were greedy, I said. And now you are pathetic. You asked me if I would send my son to prison. Let me ask you, would a son try to send his father to a mental asylum? You already have my answer. You gave it to me yourself last night. I looked at George. George, is there a way for him to avoid this? Terrell looked up, his face slick with tears, a new desperate hope flooding his eyes. Yes, George said. As I told Mr. Coleman before this meeting, he is conditionally merciful. He is willing to instruct my office not to forward this entire beautiful airtight file to the district attorney's office. Anything, Terrell cried, still on his knees. I'll do anything, Dad. I swear. Anything. On one, George said. Very specific set of conditions. They are absolute. They are non-negotiable. Do you understand? Terrell nodded frantically. Yes, just tell me. First, George said, you will sign the full and detailed confession of your actions, which my team has already prepared based on the document you signed earlier. Second, you will sign the divorce papers we are drafting right now, citing irreconcilable differences and waiving all claims to any community property present or future. Third, you will agree to a permanent 500-mile restraining order against Heather Preston and her parents. We must ensure you are never again under their toxic influence. Yes, I'll do it, Terrell said, nodding, grabbing at the chance. Is that it? I'll sign it all. I'll do it right now. And fourth, George said, his voice dropping, the most important condition, the one that Mr. Coleman, your father, designed himself. The heavy glass door clicked shut, plunging the room into a sudden, thick silence. The echoes of Heather's screaming and Richard's threats seemed to be sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum. They were all gone. The Prestons with their fake wealth and real cruelty. Heather with her venom and her ambition. They had vanished like a bad dream. The only one left was Terrell. He hadn't left. He couldn't. He was a heap on the floor by the conference room door, a 38-year-old man in a rumpled suit sobbing into his hands. He was a man who had just lost his wife, his in-laws, his house, and a $35 million fortune, all in the span of 15 minutes. He was completely, utterly, and finally alone. Diane let out a long, shaky breath and sat down heavily in her chair. Monique. My niece moved quietly to stand behind her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. George Patterson, my lawyer, showed no emotion at all. He walked calmly back to the head of the table. He picked up the signed 10-page care and property transfer agreement, the confession, and tapped it neatly against the table. He placed it carefully into a new unmarked folder. Terrell didn't move. He just knelt on the expensive rug, his shoulders shaking with these awful, gasping, choked sobs. They were the sounds of a child who finally understands, far too late, that he is in terrible, irreversible trouble. I wanted to feel something. Pity, anger, anything. But I just felt empty. I felt a vast, aching sadness for the boy I had raised and the man he had failed to become. I let him cry for a long, heavy minute. He needed to feel the absolute bottom of the pit he had dug for himself. Finally, George cleared his throat. Mr. Coleman. Terrell flinched at the formal name. He slowly, painfully pushed himself up from the floor. His face was a wreck, red and swollen, his suit stained with his own tears. He looked at George, his eyes wild with terror. Please, Terrell whispered. His voice was hoarse. Just let me go. I'll leave. I'll go to a motel. I won't bother you again. I have nothing. It's over. George Patterson stared at him, his face impassive. You are mistaken, Mr. Coleman. You still have a great many things. Terrell looked confused. What, you have criminal liabilities, George stated. Terrell's head snapped up. What are you talking about? It's over. It's a family matter, an inheritance thing. You won. You took it all. This was never a meeting about an inheritance, Terrell. George said, his voice dropping, becoming the sharp, clinical voice of a prosecutor. This was a meeting to finalize the evidence against you. You seem to be under the impression that this ends here. It does not. It ends in a courtroom. Evidence for what? George actually pulled a new yellow legal pad from his briefcase and clicked his pen. Let's list them, shall we? First, he said, conspiracy to commit felony elder fraud. You, your wife, and your in-laws conspired to deprive your parents of their legal property by making fraudulent claims of mental incompetence. He held up the stack of papers. They had all signed a charge, to which you have all very helpfully just confessed to in writing with witnesses. Terrell began to shake, a visible tremor that started in his hands. No, we just thought. Second George continued writing on the pad. Attempted wire and bank fraud, a federal offense. 3 months ago, you and Richard Preston personally petitioned the First National Trust Bank to gain control of the Coleman Trust's assets, making false claims about your father's mental state. The bank's security footage is excellent. The manager's testimony is even better. I was just worried about him, Terrell pleaded. Third, George went on, ignoring him.